When you live with an anxious or a fearful dog, it can be really hard to know how you're supposed to behave for the best. After all, we are subjected to a raft of reductive and emotive posts on the internet that purport to tell us about these emotions. Some of these posts, they reassure us that we can't reinforce fear, that there is no harm in supporting your dogs or reassuring your dogs or even letting their behaviours just play out. It doesn't matter what we do because you can't reinforce fear. Others tell us off for what they call coddling our dogs and making our dogs' fears worse. So what is the truth? Hi, I'm Emma and I'm a canine behaviour consultant. I have a passion for all things emotion. So let us get into it and find out where we are. So first off, let's be clear. Only behaviour can be reinforced. Only behaviour can be reinforced. If it's not a behaviour, it can't be reinforced. So since fear and anxiety are emotions, they're not behaviours, posts that tell you that you can't reinforce fear, technically correct. You couldn't reinforce any other emotion. Fear is not a behaviour. It's an emotion. So at least we would kind of agree on that. So I think they're probably right about that, technically. But as you know, if you've been here with me for any length of time at all, you know that it is going to be much more complex than that, more complicated. And hence they're technically right. So what do I mean when I say that it is more complex, more complicated than that? We would love it if our constructs would live in neat little boxes. This is an emotion, this is fear. It comes after exposure, to some icky thing, like heights or open spaces or snakes if you're a human. That is a physiological reaction that involves biology, that you see the scary stuff, you experience the scary stuff, and the sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system, it kicks into play whether you want it to or not, sending a cascade of neurochemicals, sending that cascade of hormones hurtling through your body to prepare you to freeze, to run, or to fight. You experience the icky thing, then you feel fear, then you experience the chemical cascade, and then you've got some behaviour that goes with it. That's our fear, and it lives in its neat little box. And then on the other side, we've got anxiety. It's another emotion. It comes when we're anticipating the icky stuff, before the icky stuff, or when our spidey senses are tingling and telling us that something might happen. And this happens because of the context that we're in, or because we've learned that this is the kind of situation in which icky stuff happened in the past and it might happen again in the future. So anxiety is a physiological reaction as well and involves biology too, and it yokes in our attentional processes just as fear does. If you're afraid, you can't concentrate on anything else, but you're anticipating the scary stuff and your wakefulness increases. So there's a slightly different and sometimes overlapping neurochemical and hormonal cascade, and that also hurtles through our bodies, keen to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball, that we get ourselves in a game, that we're on red alert for something to happen, just in case. And that would be our anxiety living in its neat little box, very different from the box that fear lives in. You're worrying about a potential icky thing that could happen, then you feel anxiety, then you experience a chemical cascade that alters your attention, it shifts your goals, shifts your priorities, makes it really hard, it interferes with every other thing that you might want to do with those more fruitful activities, like where there's a spider in the bathroom. It just makes it really, really hard to do the normal bathroom-related activities that you would do in there, like brushing your teeth as scrupulously or methodically and meticulously as you would usually. So if this is how things are with emotions, then posts say that you cannot reinforce an emotion would be absolutely right. They are not behaviours. Emotions are not behaviours. That emotions cannot be reinforced any more than things like heartbeats could be, or heart rate variability. Oh, P.S. though, some studies in animals have found that physiological functions are reinforceable or sensitive to reinforcement. And yeah, it's more complicated than that because there's a whole biofeedback kind of a thing. And yeah, it's definitely not as clear cut as this is a physiological response or this is an emotion and it cannot be reinforced. So it's more complicated than that. And there's more nuance than we might expect. And when we come out with truisms, they often turn out to be more yeah, technically true on the majority of times, but not always. So for the last 80 years, we've been looking at how we can reinforce physiological responses, and there's a small degree, and it is small. But it's already more complex than saying that emotions, should they be biological processes, and there are people who think that they can't be reinforced. But in general, that angry bloke ranting about us coddling our dogs, reinforcing fears, he'd be absolutely wrong then, wouldn't he? Wouldn't he? What makes it so complicated? And actually comes back to just like your school of thought. It depends. Yes, philosophy. It comes back to your philosophy, your view, your understanding of emotions. That sounds like weird. Like, why would it depend on philosophy? And what does that tell us about whether you can reinforce fear or not? Why you might believe that you could, or why people believe that you can't? So schools of thought are simply that. They're just ways of thinking, particularly that other people belong to as well. But they're opinions, and they're nothing more than that. They don't have to be like, when we think of opinions, we think of like some random ridiculous opinion based on nothing more than your own, airy beliefs. But they don't have to be some nonsense that you picked up off a conspiracy website. Opinions, the schools of thought, can be rooted in rationale, in reason, and in explanation. They can be rooted in your interpretation of that evidence, and lots of science's interpretation of evidence. Being evidence-based doesn't mean that you only stick to the just provable things that you definitely and categorically know are wrong or right. You can be evidence-based and still have an opinion about the evidence that you're looking at. In the West, our schools of thought, they tend to be influenced by dusty old dead guys from centuries ago whose opinions you probably don't care for, and you probably didn't even realise that you are reiterating. René Descartes is one of those dusty old dead guys. Why on earth would your view about whether or not you can reinforce a dog's fear or not be influenced by some bloke living in France some 400 years ago? Descartes, so he's the I think therefore I am guy, he was very much governed by what the church said that he could or could not publish. So at that time, science and the church were engaged in a very tense and fraught relationship that often ended really badly for science individuals who spoke out against religious doctrines. That was the world in which Descartes lived. In turn, the church tended also to promote your work shamelessly if you said things that they found to be uncontroversial, in line with what they were trying to say. So what did Descartes say about animal emotions? So firstly said that the mind, all the cognition and emotion and perception and predictions and learning stuff and memory, that was separate from the body. That's our Cartesian dualism, that mind and body are very different, that the soul is something very different than the physical, the meat sack. And he went on to share his 3 pillars about how humans differed from animals, and they've governed science since. One is that we humans, or many of us, can talk. Put aside for a minute those dogs who can say sausages and parrots and minor birds and all of those people who can't or don't talk like babies. Please don't challenge Descartes while he's coming up with his philosophical theories and science theories about how humans are superior to animals. And forget as well that animal communication or gestures or, gorillas and golden doodles that can use touchpads and communicate that way. Forget those. But his second pillar of difference is that humans perceived what they sensed. We had perception and animals don't. They sense, but they don't perceive. But that sounds odd. Like, what does that mean? Well, the easiest example I can think of is to remember that you have senses that you can't perceive, that you really don't perceive as, until you sometimes in difficulty. Like, you've got baroreceptors about pressure and aeroreceptors that tell you how much oxygen is in the air and how much oxygen is in your blood. Generally speaking, people aren't aware of atmospheric pressure, like, oh, it feels very heavy pressure today, or the quality of oxygen, other than kind of like those old lady, I feel it in my waters kind of a way. But if you go too far up a mountain or you surface too quickly from a deep sea dive, and your baroreceptors, your aeroreceptors will put your body into a general state of panic to preserve itself. but you won't perceive anything other than the sensation of panic, and that panic you would feel in all circumstances. So even though you can sense pressure and you can sense oxygen levels, your body has sensors for those, you aren't aware of them, you don't perceive them. And that was Descartes' argument about animals, that they could sense, they had sensors, but they didn't make sense, they didn't perceive. They got information coming in, but they weren't aware of it. They were not sentient, in other words. And we still have those discussions today that are very Cartesian arguments about sentience. And that was Descartes' second pillar. His third pillar was that animals did not have immortal souls. Now, the jury's still out on that. Mainly, though, this was because of pillar 1 and pillar 2, which is animals can't talk and they don't sense, don't perceive, which is why he was adamant about them not being able to get into heaven. And the idea of a sheep pressing sheepadoodle, a button pressing sheepadoodle, who could ask to go out for a pee and then share their joy at seeing a friend they've not seen for a while, that would probably have driven him nuts. Like, did they have then immortal souls? Why would it have driven him nuts? Because if sheepadoodles can ask you to play and tell you afterwards by pressing a button to say, nice, I enjoyed that, then that too means that they could inherit eternal life, and then humans are not that different from the animals. But that was seriously uncool, church-threatening stuff. And most of us probably don't think these Cartesian pillars have anything to do with us about how we feel about our dog's emotions. But they shaped science and culture for centuries and still continue to. Even Darwin's theories that species are interconnected and vary by degree rather than by kind, they didn't really put paid to that notion. Besides, by the time of Darwin, Western society, we were long into the exploitation and the harm of animals, depending on the idea that they couldn't suffer, and we'd have had a lot of trouble pulling back from that view. We're still having trouble pulling back from it. So you could come to this argument about animal emotions, about whether we can reinforce fear, with a Cartesian school of thought that animals don't even feel fear, and many scientists do. Or you could think that the emotional experience of animals is, they have one, but it's off limits for us to understand. And many scientists take that view too, and that's just another school of thought. You may want to say that dogs have anxiety-like states, but they're so far different from our human experience of anxiety or fear, words created by humans to describe human experience, that to call it anxiety would be akin to calling Velveeta or Dairy cheese. Like, it's just insulting to the category of cheese. It's so far away from what it means to be cheese that it challenges the very definition of the word. And that's how some researchers feel about animal emotions, that they are so far away, or they would be so far away from human experience if we really could understand them, that animal experiences of fear or anxiety, to call them those words feels like a definitional violation that doesn't suit us or the animals. And ironically, the kind of people who get mad at the rest of us for telling our panicked dog when there's a wasp in the room or there's a storm that things are going to be okay, they're actually the kind of people, camouflage wearing people generally, who call their dog businesses like things like Alpha Canine or some such ludicrous thing, as if their dogs are robots who don't have an emotional experience at all and can't suffer. I don't know why they're so angry, so invested in animal feelings, that we are reinforcing fear, when they spend most of their time telling us that dogs just experience shock collars as information, as objective information to help them learn a behaviour. But your school of thought is important, and it shapes how you approach this question. And it is a question, and it doesn't have a solid answer. My school of thought, my personal school of thought, is that of biological materialism. What that means is I believe the universe is made up of biological and chemical stuff, identifiable stuff, quantifiable physical rules apply to that stuff, and those rules can be understood. And I believe that mental processes, things like cognition and emotions, that they arise from this biological and chemical stuff. So Descartes, to my mind, wrong. To my mind, there is no divide for me between mind and body. I think he's also wrong on other stuff too, but I don't mind saying aloud these things, that Descartes was wrong, because the church aren't going to execute me as a heretic in the 21st century, I'd like to hope. But my view is that as a best guess estimate, emotions, cognition, all of those kind of black box experiences, learning, consciousness even, that they all arise from the meat sack and the jelly in the brain, from the physical stuff, the chemical interactions, the biology. But it's just a school of thought. I've got really good reasons why I think like this. I've done a lot of reading, and I would be happy to explain them to you if you've got a few hours to spare or you're interested in that kind of thing. But I also know it's not a hill I'm going to die on. I'm not prepared to defend those views rigorously. And if some God-fearing folk from the 17th century came and pressed me on my opinions and threatened me with burning or hanging, I'd not be prepared to die for these beliefs. It's just a school of thought. Besides, it could be completely off base. I don't know that mind doesn't exist as a separate mystical stuff. And I also know that there's more to life than things that I understand, particularly because my understanding is very, very, very much shaped by all of the science that's been shaped in turn by views like that of Descartes. So it is a very westernized school of thought, even so. So how does this relate to whether or not you can reinforce? That seems like a very long-winded way to get here. Can you reinforce fear? Well, for me, emotions emerge from biological and chemical processes. They are entangled with them. They have physical properties that have been advantageous to our survival. And like every other physical experience that there is in the known universe, the more you try to divide those physical experiences up into neat little boxes that you can call, like you could give the headings of chapters in a cognitive neuroscience textbook, like this is sensation, and it's separate from perception, and there is a dividing line between the two, and this is sentience, and it lives in its little box. The more you try to do that, the more you realize it's just impossible. At what point does a sensation become a perception? At what point does it become a decision? And at what point do our goals then shift and direct our behavior, our actions? At what point do cognitive experiences actually become actions? And these constructs, they can't be divided up neatly into boxes. They can't be, because they are entangled with each other in gloriously complex, beautifully entangled, interactive, feedback and feed forward kind of loops. And that's the beauty of cognition. But what about fear? At what point does your sensation that there's a snake lying in the grass become an awareness, a perception of the snake? And at what point does that then become a decision to act? At what point does it become a physiological response, like the cascade, the sympathetic nervous cascade of adrenaline and noradrenaline and other things? It's really, really difficult to draw that. It's impossible to draw that neat dividing line between physiological emotion states and biology and behavior. And that's one reason I just believe it's too complex to say that we can't reinforce fear, because fear it comes so integrated into behavior that we can't say fear is an emotion. Like, behavior doesn't live in a neat little box. It's rooted in behavior. Fear is intricately involved in behavior, intricately. It's entangled with behavior in such complex ways that we can't extrapolate the two. Fear can be a motivating state, for instance, that leads to behavior, causes behavior, just as the relief that we feel after escaping a bad thing might also be an intrinsic and internal reinforcer that makes behavior more likely again in the future. So behavior and emotion are so entangled that it becomes conceptually and philosophically and scientifically hard to distinguish where emotion as a cognitive event ends and behavior then begins, where a physiological cascade of neurotransmitters and brain juice and hormones in the body, where they end and where action then begins. We want so much to believe in specialization and categorization and neat boxes. We're invested in that in science in the West, but nature doesn't actually seem to do those neat, clear-cut divisions so well. I mean, take a look at the light spectrum, for example. Sometimes there are clearly red bits, like in a rainbow there are red bits, and sometimes that's an orange bit, but there are points in between those where it's orangey red and where it's reddy orange, and it's just exactly the same when we try and slice and dice emotion and where we try and divide that from behavior. That trying to separate it is like trying to separate red from orange in the spectrum. Sarah Stremming from Cog Dog Radio, she gives a lovely example of that with her dog's tippy-tappy feet when her dog was waiting for a treat. So if we had to guess, me and you, we might say that there are some emotions there. We're not thinking that animals are just like meat sacks. And you and I might argue about whether it's a negative sensation of frustration or whether it's a positive feeling of anticipation that a treat is on the way. But there are anticipatory emotion states there, even if they're hard for us to demonstrate, even if we've got the very best and most expensive technology, fMRI scanners and blood tests and saliva tests and heart rate monitors and so on. So even when we can read physiology, we can't necessarily say there's emotion, but there is behaviour. We've got tippy tappy feet, and where there's behaviour, there are things that might be something we could reinforce. If behaviour is voluntary, like tippy tappy feet might be, and whether it's sensitive to reinforcement, of course. And not all behaviours are sensitive to reinforcement for a whole bunch of different reasons, including our species and our stage in development. So sometimes they get voluntary as we age, and they weren't voluntary when we were babies. So when we say that fear is not a behaviour, it's so hard to separate it from behaviour that we run the risk of coming a cropper in trying to separate and distinguish the two. So fear drives behaviour as an antecedent state. It helps select behaviour. It goes, well, that behaviour might work here. It interrupts behaviour. It even reinforces or punishes behaviour as opposed to feedback. So trying then to split behaviour, to divorce behaviour from emotion, that would need a damn fine surgeon to come along with finer scalpels than we currently possess in our science, and that we may ever actually possess. It may turn out, and I think will turn out this way, that behaviour is not separable from cognitive processes. Like, we can't separate emotion at all from behaviour. But not all behaviours are reinforceable. Many researchers actually believe that the kind of behaviours that animals perform when they're afraid are what they would say insensitive to reinforcement. Professor Robert Bowles, he was one of these people, and his student and now fear researcher extraordinaire, Professor Michael Fanslow, those are his words, that that defensive behaviours are insensitive to reinforcement. And what they mean when they say that defensive behaviours like startle, like freezing, like panicked attempt to escape, whatever those behaviours are, those defensive behaviours for our species, when we are faced with some particularly icky stuff that's relevant to our species, the behaviours that we exhibit when that sympathetic branch of our autonomic nervous system has been activated, when that's pumping adrenaline, noradrenaline around our system, and it takes over to save ourselves from being unalived in the most unseemly and untimely ways, these behaviours are not sensitive to reinforcement. Or punishment for that matter, or operant extinction for that matter. These behaviours just occur like a knee-jerk reflex when ducking, when like something kind of unexpected comes flying at our head. These behaviours, like emotions, they run on reflexive and Pavlovian mechanisms. They're not sensitive to reinforcement. So whether defensive behaviours like these actually involve fear also depends on your school of thought. It's just whether you believe that they do or not. Are you more convinced by the evidence than someone else? There are researchers like Professor Joseph Ledoux, really famous for his work on anxiety, who believe that defensive behaviours, freeze, flight, fight behaviours, they're just behaviours, and they don't necessarily entail an emotional experience at all. They may do, but they're not necessarily going to do that. And a growing body of researchers actually take it as read that they do. So defensive behaviours and fear are so intertwined and enmeshed, so mixed up with each other, and they are so insensitive to reinforcement. And then this just brings us to another of those things that you think that'd be easier to divide, like voluntary behaviour and involuntary behaviour. They'd be easy to divide, and it's not easy to divide at all. Bowles, Fanslow, plenty of others believe that defensive behaviours are insensitive to reinforcement. That would be another reason that we could say that fear, you can't reinforce fear, because fear behaviours, defensive behaviours, are involuntary ones that we can't control. They are reflex-like. They can become temporarily more sensitive, or they can temporarily habituate to stuff, and they can pick up a whole bunch of learning, Pavlovian learning, about when would be a good time to do them, but they aren't shaped by consequences. They aren't shaped by reinforcers or punishers. They're only shaped by the antecedent stimuli that come before them and generate them and say, now would be a really good time to do those behaviours that you do to get you out of here. But for these authors, avoidance behaviours that are rooted in those kind of anxiety, negative vibes that lead us to want to move away from things, to find safety, they're also on a spectrum and that can't be easily divided, that are voluntary behaviours and involuntary behaviours. So in their view, the more urgent, the more critical, the more imminent and actual threat to the integrity of your being is, the less likely it is that the behaviours associated with that are going to be shaped by whatever happens, the consequences. Those are the ones that are insensitive to reinforcement. But, and there is a but, when it's less urgent, when it's less critical, when it's less imminent, or the threat hasn't revealed itself yet, we're already kind of like anticipating that it might happen. In other words, when we're anxious, then behaviours can be shaped by whether or not they successfully help us delay the bad stuff, put off the bad stuff from happening, put it off completely. So in other words, if the behaviours are arising from anxiety about bad stuff that might happen, if those behaviours work, if they help us cope, if they're reinforceable, then those avoidance behaviours that help us put off, help us avoid the bad stuff, or even help us cope with the bad stuff, they are reinforceable. So behaviours that are rooted in a prediction that bad stuff will happen unless you can successfully avoid it, those are reinforceable. Behaviours entangled with anxiety then, and those anticipatory concerns with predictions about what might happen. So you can kind of just see how messy it is. It's messy for so many reasons. It's messy because of our learning history. When my dog Liddy, when she sees a wasp, that wasp disrupts all of her other behaviour. It stops her doing other things. She can do nothing else. Especially if that wasp is imminent, if it's in the same room, if it's close. She can't chew, she can't rest, she can't watch the hot Malinois on John Wick 3. She cannot do those things. But the bad stuff hasn't actually happened yet. It's just like it might happen and it's quite imminent. And the bad stuff then will be the sting. She's learned from that behaviour. But the wasp, he's usually just hanging around by the window. He might go out again. He's wondering how the hell he got in. I don't know. Lydia at that moment, she's got choices. Her choice is to delay indefinitely. She's going to avoid that wasp. She chooses to go into the bedroom, to go into the kitchen, to move away. She avoids that wasp completely. And that is voluntary behaviour. It's reinforceable behaviour that she's in charge of, that's based on her learning history and a fear that a bad thing that happened. And that has been very much reinforced by one rock solid consequence. It worked. Going in the bedroom, going in the kitchen has, touch wood, 100% of the time resulted in successful avoidance of the wasp sting. She has never been stung by a wasp in doing that behaviour. And what this means is that she's seen the scary stuff. A threat is imminent, it's near. And those flight behaviours, there's those behaviours that emanate from her anxiety. And her feelings put an end to her ability to do anything else. So fear interferes with those things. There's no more relaxing on the sofa until that threat is over. And it is a cue-based fear, to use the science language, that absolutely leads to an action. It leads to behaviour. It leads to avoidance. And avoidance behaviours absolutely are definitely reinforceable, not least by the relief when they work. So when a behaviour that we do works and gets us out of jail, then it's reinforceable. So it remains that you can only reinforce behaviour, not emotion. Technically, with some exceptions, we can't reinforce emotion. And it remains true that you can only reinforce certain behaviours, the voluntary behaviours. Whether or not you think animals have voluntary behaviours, that's another school of thought. When Michael Fanslow said that defensive behaviours are insensitive to reinforcement, I am not calling him out on that. I am not saying he's wrong. He's in my school of thought. I believe him. I think he's absolutely right that those behaviours that come from sympathetic nervous system activation, they're not reinforceable. He knows way more about fear than any person on this planet that I know. But I also know, and he agrees, that avoidance behaviours that end in delaying the bad stuff, it puts it off, or it avoids the bad stuff completely, it never happens, that those behaviours are reinforceable. And these behaviours for me are so enmeshed in cognitive processes like predictions, like learning history, like experience, like memory, like emotion, that it's just not so easy to say that you can't reinforce those behaviours. They're so enmeshed. If you ask me, it's a very good reason for calling these like reinforceable avoidance behaviours, saying they're rooted in anxiety, that there are reinforceable aspects of anxiety, but not fear. So if you want to say you can't reinforce fear, I'm going to agree with you. And if you want to say that you can't reinforce defensive behaviours, I'm going to agree with you on that as well. But if you want to say that there are aspects that you can reinforce avoidance behaviours that are rooted in the choices that we make, that are shaped and driven by our anticipatory emotions, by our concerns about what bad stuff might befall us and unalive us, anxiety, if you want to use that word, then I'm going to agree with that as well. So in the end, I think that things are just too enmeshed and integrated with each other to separate out into finer categories. In fact, I'd go as far as to say I don't think we're ever going to be able to do that. You know, the reddy oranges, the orangey reds between the two. And hence, that's why I said technically at the beginning. So as to whether interacting with your dog can create avoidance behaviours, I think that's a topic for another time. I'm not going to get into that right now. Whether it can or not, I don't know. Whether it can work in our favour, I don't know. We'll see. Ultimately, though, cognitive events like emotions, they are embodied. We do them with our bodies. They are for our bodies. And our bodies have physiological states and mental states that work in complex, beautifully entangled feedback loops and feed-forward loops with each other. We can't separate out our bodies from an emotion. We can't separate biology from an action, from emotion from behaviour. There really isn't a point, if a wasp comes flapping around you, that your fear of being stung, your feeling, is distinct from your behaviour. They're enmeshed and entwined in each other. Cognition, cognitive processes like emotions, should you belong to a school of thought where you think that animals can have those experiences, akin to ours in some way at least, these processes are extended into the environment and they're embedded in the environment as well. They begin with stimuli in the environment and also in our bodies, recognising the sensations in our bodies, and they're designed to interact with the environment itself. This is perhaps even more true of animal flavours of emotion than it is for human flavours of emotion, since animals live so much more in their bodies and in their niches compared to us. For example, you know, us lunatics living in our heads so much, we could create an emotion just by thinking. Cognition and cognitive processes like emotions, they're also inactive. And what I mean by inactive is that they are designed to be acted upon. Other researchers call them action tendencies. They drive action. Emotions help create motivational states that establish goals and establish outcomes for us. They narrow the kind of behaviours we can choose. They drive behaviour, and they're also feedback after behaviour, perhaps also acting as a kind of intrinsic or internal automatic reinforcer in themselves. When you think about the relief that we feel after we've survived, they're there as behaviours that are selected, and they shape behaviours that we'll take in the future. Relief shapes behaviours we'll take in the future. And behaviour is also, for want of fMRI scanners and EEG machines and physiological measures and all kinds of ways of measuring internal experiences, behaviour is our way of understanding and measuring emotions. We use behaviour to measure emotions like fear and like anxiety. And it's another one of those inextricable connections between emotion and behaviour that make my answer to the question about whether emotions like fear can be reinforced. It makes it kind of a hedgy, well, it's complicated. Behaviour exists on a spectrum, from automatic and involuntary, the reflex-like, for example, right the way through to voluntary and volitional, the choices that we make about the behaviours that we use. It's a spectrum like light waves, where it is impossible, may always be impossible to know where the biological stuff ends, the involuntary stuff, and where the cognitive stuff begins, where Pavlov ends and Skinner begins, where automatic behaviours end and where choices begin. And it's got variation within there that are affected by temporary or more permanent forms of learning, like sensitization, habituation, and things like associative learning that also affect our the behaviours that we choose. So where it may be true, to say that we can't reinforce reflexes or defensive behaviours, you'll get some odd word coming out saying, well, maybe other things that are more sensitive to reinforcement, to punishment, and to operant extinction. So I am sorry. Am I? Am I sorry not to be able to give you a definitive answer there? I would love to be able to give you a straight answer to say, no, Virginia, you cannot reinforce fear. That man on the internet is wrong. But as I said at the beginning, to my school of thinking, and it is a school of thinking, it is more complicated than that. So it is complicated. It is really complex. We know we can't reinforce emotions, they're not behaviours. We know certain behaviours are not reinforceable either, and defensive behaviours are one of those blocks that are insensitive to reinforcement. But we've got this whole body of other things, these avoidance behaviours that are linked into anxiety, that have reinforceable elements to them. So it is more complex than that, and I am sorry not to be able to give you a straight answer on that.